We will be, there you go. You got the disclosure. I was going to say we will be recording this. We know we have a few community partners out today. So if you're watching this later, we welcome you to our Learning Lab. Next slide, please. Also, I want to, before we get into the agenda, I want to acknowledge and say Happy Women's History Month. So just taking time to acknowledge all these great, incredible women in our lives, whether they're in this meeting today or you work with them, or it's a parent, a family member, a friend. I want to encourage folks to take the time to acknowledge a very special woman in your life. Maybe it's today or throughout the month. We appreciate everyone's contributions. We've had a lot in this process with our clean energy plan. So just shout out to all the incredible women out there doing this work and the work they do every day. So I'm going to run through the agenda. So right now we're doing our welcome and meeting logistics. Then we will have Angela Long and Seth Wiggins go over and walk through our clean energy plan and IRP report. So think of this as like the trailer to the movie that's going to premiere later this month when we file our report. And then we'll have some topics, as we heard, that were brought to our attention that community wanted to hear about, is the preferred portfolio, which was discussed, and the yearly price impacts, which was discussed last month at last month's roundtable. Seth will be presenting that, and then we'll close our meeting with some next steps and how we will be proceeding forward. So we will be continuing learning labs, but we'll get more into that at the end. But these will be going on, and we'll start a new series. So we'll have different topics that will be discussed. And next month's topic will be transportation electrification. So please feel free to mark your calendar. It will be at the same time, same day, every third Thursday from 10 to 12. We hope to see you there. Next slide, please. So for those, just want to let you know, if you have any technical challenges today, we have Joe Boyles, who will be providing technical assistance. You can go out into a breakout room if you need assistance. If you look on the left-hand side, we have our icons in the description on the right. So if you need to lower or raise your audio volume, that is the icon. We have the microphone. Everyone is muted upon arrival. So if you want to say something, you can click that button to come off mute. We will be using the chat box feature. We encourage engagement. So if you have questions, comments, reactions, responses, please feel free to use the chat box. Also, we have the video. You are not required to be on video, but if you'd like to come off so we could see your faces, that is great. We will be using the raise hand feature. So if you have a question or comment or have a response to something, just please use the raise hand and we will call on you. We have enabled closed caption to be more accessible. So that is where we're at. So next slide, please. Here are our operating agreements that many may be familiar with. If you're not, we will go through them just really quickly. We established these operating agreements with our communities as we believe it is foundational to building trust. This also helps us create a safe space. We established these common agreements such as respect, honoring diversity of thought, and inclusivity. I want to encourage folks to practice curiosity and seek to understand different perspectives while we're in this space. So we ask that folks stay engaged while we're in this space, avoid or try not to check out. However, I want to say everyone has full agency and autonomy. So if you need to step away, take a break, feel free to do that. But just when you return, just make sure that you are engaged. Be willing to experience some discomfort. So we know that some folks have different views, especially on certain topics such as inequities. Just be willing to hear other folks' perspective, and sitting in that discomfort, we ask participants to agree to some discomfort. This helps propel a more honest and meaningful conversation. Speak your truth. Be willing to take risks and be honest about your thoughts and saying what and not saying what others want to hear. So we are asking folks to honor and respect each other's truth as their own lived experience. Expect and accept non-closure. That means there's no quick fix. So we may not get to everything today, and that's okay. So therefore, we must commit to going on this journey of growth together. And then we ask folks to share their airtime, meaning giving folks who may not have spoken a lot the space and opportunity to do so. So if folks agree to these operating agreements, may I ask for a thumbs up? And you can use the reactions button in the lower right-hand corner. You can find that. Great. I see some hands up, some thumbs up. Great. All right, so we are going to move on to the next slide. Thanks, everyone. Did I miss a slide? Oh, maybe I didn't. Did we do the meeting objectives? Sorry. I'm so sorry. So that was my bad. Oh, let's go over the meeting objectives. Sorry about that. So we want to share the work. Today's meeting objectives and goals are to share the work that we've all accomplished together in this room. We've had many community advocates and partners help us with our clean energy plan. So we want to express our deepest gratitude to our community partners, and we really appreciate your contributions throughout this process. We are going to have time for questions, so an open forum for questions and comments to go over, to respond to anything in the presentation or other questions you may have about the clean energy process. And then the last final step will be next steps, and we'll share our timeline of what to expect next. And my apologies for forgetting that. This is the most important part. So I just want everybody to clap it up for, if you want to use the emoji, clap for everyone who's participated throughout these 7 series labs and all their contributions, because you've helped us tremendously, and it is invaluable. So again, deepest gratitude to everyone who's helped us get here. Okay, sorry, Shadia, you can now skip to the part of the presentation. So now we are going to discuss our clean energy plan and integrated resource report. We will have Seth Wiggins, the Manager of Strategy and Integrated Resource Planning, and Angela Long, Senior Manager of Strategy on the Distributed Resource Planning team.
Awesome. Thanks, Samantha. So my name is Seth Wiggins. I'm, as you said, the manager of the Integrated Resource Planning team here at PGE. And I'm going to help walk through what we plan to file in about 2 weeks, the Clean Energy Plan and the IRP. We're combining these 2 documents because in the Venn diagram between the 2, it's mostly overlap. There are a few standalone segments in each, but really they are one and the same at this point. So what we're hoping to do in this presentation is to basically cover the outlines of each chapter, the purpose of them, and some of the results later on. Basically, the whole of the document, with the exception of chapter 1, the whole of the document is leading up to portfolio analysis. So it's all just building the foundations and the inputs to portfolio analysis, which is and the outputs of which are the preferred portfolio and the action plan. So we're going to go over each chapter and then talk about those results at the end. The main difference there is the chapter 1, which is the clean energy plan, our strategy for decarbonization, and then some information about resiliency and our approach to the equity lens, which Angela will be talking about. And so if you go to the next slide, please. This provides an overview of the structure of the report. So this document is not short. It is last count upwards of 600-700 pages, about half and half between chapters and appendices. So the chapters cover the information that you'll want to read. That's again building up to the action plan. The appendices are for a technical audience looking for very specific information. So there's extra information there about specific analyses that we've done. that we have done, specific inputs that we used. It's, if you're curious, we try to present as much information as is relevant to the development of the IRP, with a hope that others can learn from our process. We've spent years developing this plan, and we think that we did a great job. We've put a lot of effort into it, and we'd like to, for other people that are going through similar challenges to us, to be able to see what we have done and why. An example of this is the treatment of capacity contribution of renewable resources based off of different transmission quality. This is an issue for us and many others, and so we'd like to show what we have done. And so in the appendix, we have information like that. It's not leading to anything. It's not building towards the action plan, but it's informational. And so there are hundreds of pages there that are hopefully useful to someone down the line. And then we have 4 external studies that we are making available in this docket as well. Now, there's one other component of the report, which is the reporting of the specific outcomes. So for each portfolio, we're going to be providing all the information that we discussed in UM 2225, which is the HB 2021 implementation docket that we went through in 2022. And we will be providing that information as well, and I can discuss and possibly show some of that information as well. But meat and potatoes is the chapters, and we'll be going over them now. During this presentation, please stop me at any time if you have any questions on anything I'm saying. I'm going to move fairly quickly, as this is just looking at the overview and the purpose, but again, happy to take any questions before we get to those results. So just raise your hand, and hopefully I or someone else will see that. So starting with chapter 1. So this is the clean energy plan. This is the main area where we discuss the company's pathway for decarbonization. And so it is a synthesis of all the information in the rest of the report. So you could think of this as our executive summary for decarbonization. It is a robust and comprehensive chapter, and we think that it's appropriate that most folks spend the majority of the time on this chapter. This is where everything was building to, where we take the action plan and insert that into the rest of the company's efforts towards decarbonization, our plan to meet the decarbonization requirements established in HB 2021 and were PGE's corporate goals as well for decarbonization. And so, yes, we talk about the action plan and all the portfolio analysis building towards that, but we also discuss some opportunities, potential barriers, and critical dependencies of this plan going forward. And so, again, if you have 100 units of time to devote to this document, we expect that most people will spend 99 of them right here in chapter 1. It is our comprehensive view of this. Going to chapter 2, on the next slide, please. We discuss potential areas of support for this clean energy transition. The decarbonization targets, implementing them will not be cheap, and mitigating customer price impacts is going to be a critical component. It is one of the 3 main components of an energy transition. So the other 2 being reliability and the actual decarbonization. You have to get all 3 of them right. And so this is the support for the energy transition is going to significantly help, or could potentially significantly help one of these legs. The it's a pretty exciting time right now in the energy industry because there are significant financial opportunities available for us to pursue, both with the Infrastructure and Inflation Reduction Acts. They provide billions and billions of dollars towards the energy industry, and so we'd like to maximize our utilization of those funds. And so we discuss in this chapter a number of opportunities that we have pursued and that we continue to. This is going to be critical as we go forward, and we look forward to having this as part of the discussion in both the docket for the CEP over the next 6 to 8 months-ish, and just as as part of the industry going forward. If you could turn, please, to the next chapter, we talk about the planning environment. So, the IRP and the CEP that's built upon it are it's a resource plan that where we're seeking to identify any deficits and fill them with potential new resources. This is all done under a context of a variety of local, state, and federal policies, and we discuss many of them here. Policies are tricky for us because they are incredibly impactful towards the economic landscape under which we operate. However, they're very difficult to forecast. A great example is HB 2021. That was passed in 2021, but before that there was the Cap and Invest bill that, if you remember, the Republican walkout, just all the drama surrounding that, it took years and years for something to get passed in Oregon. We in the planning department were watching that very closely, as it would have had a major impact on, again, the economic landscape under which we operate. And so these policies, both at the state and then as well as local and federal, have a major impact on us. And so we watch those very closely. And so it's important to start the conversation here discussing what we see as the environment under which we consider this plan and what potential changes could be. I'm seeing some discussion maybe in the chat. I'm hoping someone will stop me if there's questions that I should be answering.
Yes, Seth, I will do that.
Okay.
I'm monitoring the chat right now. Folks are introducing themselves with their organization.
Sure. Okay, cool. Okay, so if you go to the next slide, then we turn to chapter 4, which is our futures and uncertainties chapter. We know that we have no idea what's going to happen over the next 20 years, which is the planning horizon of these plans. So we can take some educated guesses, and we have the best forecasts available to us that we're using, but really the uncertainty is tremendous. For example, the 2019 IRP came out in July of 2019, did not in the slightest envision a global pandemic and everything that happened following. That is frustrating in our ability to not be able to tell the future. It would be very easy to construct a plan if we had the perfect forecast of load growth, of technology costs, of prices in energy markets, all of that. That would be very simple. But we know we don't. And so understanding that we have this uncertainty of the future, we describe in this chapter how we think about that uncertainty and how we model it. So instead of saying, this is the plan, and we are going to add these resources at this specific time based off of these economic conditions, instead, we have to think about, okay, given our range of uncertainty, how do we change our modeling based on that? So the plan that we create, that one action plan at the end of all of this analysis, how is that robust to the potential changes that could come? An example of that is, again, from the the pandemic which started in 2020. So that had a major impact on demand, on load growth. And so in the 2019 IRP, we had a forecast of load, but we also had ranges of that. So we had, okay, here's reference case, which we think is, the most likely, but also what is that upper range of that, an appropriate upper range, a lower range. And so how does our plan change if those different load scenarios show up? And so in the 2019 IRP, we created a plan that we thought was robust to those different uncertainties. And we do the same in this IRP as well. So the methods, the means in which we incorporate that uncertainty are detailed in Chapter 4.
Seth, we have a question in the chat from Craig.
Mm-hmm.
What are the specifics that go into your range of uncertainty?
Sure, that's a great question. So I'll say a few things and I hope to answer the question. Let me know if I don't. So the different areas of uncertainties that we incorporate, I'm going to see if I can get them all. So load, the demand that we're going to see. We also look at economic conditions. So basically hydro conditions, how much generation we get from the hydro system, natural gas prices, carbon prices, and technology costs. So the cost of renewables going forward, and basically generation resources. We look at different costs there. We also incorporate some different model specifications into that analysis as well. So those are examples of uncertainties that we look at in basically all modeling scenarios. We also look at some specific sensitivities. Some good examples are, so what happens if you get an RTO in the region? What does that change? How does that change your need? What happens if there's a earlier exit from Colstrip? There are a number of sensitivities, and I'm not listing them comprehensively. I can, though. Does that answer your question? Again, wasn't comprehensive, but those are some of the things that we are looking at in terms of unknowns that we have going forward. Okay, that's fair. There's plenty more. And again, if you want to know about any one of those or get a more comprehensive list, happy to follow up on that. Okay, so now that we have in Chapter 4 perfectly modeled all the uncertainty going forward, we turn in this document to the next slide, please, to the forecasting of our greenhouse gas emissions. So this is clearly an important topic for this IRP and CEP. We need to be able to forecast how much we are emitting appropriately so we can accurately determine need. Previous IRP methodologies were insufficient to this task. So the emissions forecast presented in the 2019 IRP were informational and directional, but not terribly accurate. And so we invested heavily in the development of this IRP and CEP into improving our ability to forecast the emissions that we'll be creating given the uncertainties that we talked about before. So if there is a future where we have very high load growth, low hydro production, let's say high natural gas prices, and just your stable carbon prices of things like that, we want to know what is the appropriate amount of forecast for our emissions in that year. Similarly, if the load growth is low and there are different assumptions about gas prices and hydro conditions and down that list, what are the greenhouse gas emissions? And so we knew very early on in this process that HB 2021 changed how in long-term planning, we're going to be thinking about emissions. And so the appropriate way of incorporating this emissions forecasting, we knew we had to figure that out. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about how we can adjust our previous methods. And in chapter 5 of this document that's coming, we describe the improvements that we made, why we think they're appropriate, how they work, all the methods in there. I think I saw a question come up.
Yes, I can read it. Thank you. I was gonna get this question is from Arlene. We hear a lot about the price of nat gas fluctuating. How much the cost, how much is the cost of hydro vary?
So we don't vary the cost of hydro, we vary the availability of that hydro and what sort of market conditions that creates. So let me see if I can explain that better. So we forecast market prices, and we know that in a year in which there is heavy natural gas, or sorry, heavy hydro conditions, we know that there will be more energy in the market, more generation from those resources, and so market prices will be lower. We also know, conversely, if it's a very dry year, there's not much snowpack and rainfall, there will be less production from hydro resources, and so market prices will change. And so we evaluate basically those different levels of hydro in the market forecast. Now, those are, I believe we use a standard deviation over the last 10 years, or sorry, last 80 years. 80 years of hydro data, think about the appropriate levels of a variation to include. I will say also, though, moving forward a little, we do look at whether that 80-year timeline is appropriate. If the climate weren't changing, I think it would be appropriate. Just use all the historical data that you can possibly get, because the future is going to look like the past. We know, however, that the future is likely going to differ significantly from the past 80 years, given the changes in precipitation, the timing, and the events. For example, we expect precipitation patterns to be heavier in the spring and lower in the summer, and so that affects your hydro generation, and that affects resource adequacy. If you don't have as much hydro generation in the summer, that will have impacts on peak summer demand. And so we do examine that in another part of the document and an external study as well. We look at adaptations coming from climate change that we need to be making into our modeling. We do some analysis, but we're trying to push our planning efforts in this document further in that area. But for now, in the market consideration, it's a standard deviation based on those 80 years.
Seth, we have another question. Is that okay? Or
Yep.
Okay, in the chat. And I do want to say folks can raise their hand. Craig, I may need your help. We have a question from Craig. How are you including lessons learned regarding projected shortfalls in the 70s and how price increases affected the lessons which we are still paying for and will until 2044? Thanks to, and I'm not sure what WPPSS is, so maybe you can share what that acronym means, or maybe you know, Seth?
I do not.
Craig, can I call on you for clarification of what WPPSS is?
Yes, it's the Washington Power Supply System now, the Columbia Generating Station. It's the whoops plants, the nuclear plants that were built. There was going to be 5 of them up in Richland, but only number 2 was actually finished. And it was projected initially to cost, I think, 325 million. It ended up costing over 3.2 billion. And what had happened was that BPA had raised its rates 28% in 74 and 88% in 79. And by 82, the administrator of BPA was saying, we no longer have a shortfall, we have a surplus. And that was a direct result of those increasing costs, wholesale costs. And so I think it's an important lesson relative to where we are now, because there's going to be many changes ahead. And I think that price is a big determinant, particularly when we learn the lessons of Texas 3 winters ago.
Am I right to understand that the concern here is the over procurement of resources?
Or saddling debt that is not necessary if we chose a different path.
Are those, am I right to believe those would be synonymous? If you over procure a resource, you are saddling your customers with
Yes.
unnecessary debt. Okay.
Yes.
So given the resource need that we'll be talking about later in this presentation, I feel like the risk is relatively low that we're in a situation where we can be over procuring. I think the risks are heavily tilted towards under procuring. The reality is that the backbone of our generation system right now are natural gas plants. And we know that if we're going to meet HB 2021, we need to be able to turn them down. Basically to take their capacity factors, which are relatively high today, we need to be able to have the luxury to turn them down. And so the only way we get there is if we procure sufficient non-emitting resources. As you'll see in the action plan, the resources that we're going after are massive and dwarf any procurement that we've done over the past 15 years. We need to just jumping ahead, we need to be acquiring a facility larger than Wheat Ridge every single year between now and 2030. That is an incredible acceleration of procurement pace. And frankly, it's going to be very difficult to do. And so your concern of over procuring those renewable generation resources, I just don't see it right now. All the risk is on the under procurement side.
If I may follow up just a bit.
Please.
No, I agree with you. Particularly when we're going from natural gas and coal, which runs 24/7, to intermittent renewables. That's a huge change in the transition. But what I'm really trying to say is that the price and the demand are inextricably linked. And as there is scarcity in our capitalistic system, price goes up. So that is probably going to be a reality looking forward. And how it translates into demand is a question that I don't hear being addressed very often, certainly not at the Northwest Power Planning Council.
Yeah, so the technical term there is price elasticity, basically when what happens to demand as those prices go up. Unfortunately, we're not well equipped to answer this question. But Craig, I think this is an incredibly valuable topic, both to the industry as well as the utility. So the question of demand, what happens to demand as prices go up, as they are projected to do based off the resources that we're planning to acquire. So as this demand, or as these prices go up, you would expect if what we say the demand is perfectly inelastic, basically you're saying that if prices go up, customers just have to accept it and pay higher rates. But we know that customers have other options, and there are alternatives to procuring energy from your utility. In the short run, there are few options, but in the long run, we know that things like rooftop solar, behind the meter storage, those are real things that can have major impacts in the costs that customers pay. It also will have major impacts to the utility business model. And so I think you're absolutely right that the demand, the influence that prices have on demand are going to make major changes to the energy landscape right now. And one of the shortfalls of this plan is, despite our best efforts to incorporate that, we're really just starting. There's a connection between the IRP and the DSP, which will be discussed. And that's, we try to address some of the options that customers have for distributed resources and behind the meter applications. But I think, to your point, the utility and the region are should be doing a better job in this area.
And if I could just make one more quick point, I think another aspect of it that is critically important is understanding the recent trends. And I've heard from a number of sources that about 20% of customers are having a hard time paying their bills and are getting some kind of assistance. And that has increased as the economy has tanked, as the economy has changed. So those numbers might increase in the future. And how are we going to address that? I think that's a companion aspect that price and demand need to address. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a great point. Those behind the meter applications, those rooftop solar, behind the meter storage, those are options that are primarily available to wealthy residents with detached housing and the financial means to enable the disconnection from the augmentation of their generation supply. For those who don't have detached housing, available roof space, ownership of their dwelling, and financial resources, it's a struggle. And so the cost increases that we're going to be discussing later on in this document are real. Craig, you're asking some big questions right now that frankly we don't have great answers for. We do have customer bill assistance. We do have many people in the company working towards that, but the interaction of that and our decarbonization strategy is tough. And there will be trade-offs between cost impacts and the decarbonization requirements. And so addressing those is going to, we highlight those, we identify those in the document, but it's going to be really the one of three conversations that we're going to have between now and 2030, and basically for the next foreseeable future. How do we actually decarbonize? That's one question. Another question is, how do we keep the system reliable while we decarbonize? That's the second one. Third one is, how do we deal with the cost impacts? Those are the only three things that that are going to be driving decisions in our system. And we attempt in this document, in the IRP and CEP, to highlight those issues and identify areas of mitigation for each of those concerns. But we don't have final answers for any of them.
All right. Thanks, Seth, for that detailed response. I guess we're going to move on to the next section.
Yep, you can
Thanks, great for the dialogue and discussion piece.
Awesome. So again, in this chapter 5, we address the methodologies that we are now including to forecast those greenhouse gas emissions. Once we do that, we can go into chapter 6, which is the identification of resource needs. And this is where we're, could you go to the next slide, please? This is where we, this is a traditional IRP chapter where it's really the first step of 2 in an IRP. So the first step is, what is your resource need? Identify basically how big the hole is going forward. If the answer to chapter 6, so your resource need, is nothing, you have a perfectly adequate system going over 20 years, then this would be the last chapter. We would say, okay, we are done and we have 0 need and nothing needs to be done. We're just going to monitor our system and be happy with that going forward. Unfortunately, load growth continues well, unfortunately for the planning document, load growth continues, resources retire, we have to change our resource mix. And so there are significant resource needs. And in this chapter, we describe them. So there are basically 3 types of need that we talk about. One is energy. So the average need that your system has over the planning horizon. The second is capacity, which is your measure of resource adequacy, basically your ability to keep lights on over the entire planning horizon. And the third one is regulatory. So regulatory need is apart from these 2, in which you're looking at things like RPS compliance. So even if you had no energy and no energy and no capacity need, you could need more RECs generated on your system to meet any applicable regulation, so to meet RPS obligations. That's not the case given HB 2021. There are significant energy and capacity needs, energy needs coming from both load growth and the dialing back of our thermal plants. Capacity needs coming from both load growth and the expiration of contracts going forward. And so those are going to be critical components. In this chapter, we also talk about basically DER impacts on the load. So we know that if we change nothing between now and 2030, basically down to the end of the planning horizon, we know that the cost-effective levels of energy efficiency and distributed energy resources will come to our system. And so they have significant impacts on energy and capacity needs. In this chapter, we discuss how they reduce those needs, both of those, both energy efficiency and distributed energy resources. So we discuss that in that chapter. So we have a reduction in our load. And then we have a few other looks at need. And so in this chapter, we talk about some of the need sensitivities, so changes in the uptake of QFs, an accelerated load growth scenario, what would happen if contract extensions happened, and then looking at Colstrip. We also in this chapter look at climate adaptation. So basically our load, similar to what I was discussing before, our load is expected to grow, but how we measure that load growth should probably change. We shouldn't be using let's just say 2009 methods to calculate the demand going forward for both energy and capacity, when we know that when we have a much better picture right now, much better understanding of the effects of climate change as it's forecasted over the next 20 years. And so we discuss all of that in this chapter. The needs are significant. Upwards of 500 megawatts of capacity need in 2026. Those are very near term, very real, and upwards of about 900 average megawatts of energy need over between now and 2030. And that's after the acquisition of all cost-effective energy efficiency and distributed energy resources that are forecasted from the Energy Trust of Oregon and our DSP Part 2. Okay, so Chapter 6 establishes resource needs. So we know that our system requires these things going forward. In Chapter 7, we start introducing some things that, Chapter 7 and 8, some things that could help fill that need. Again, if there's zero need in Chapter 6, that's the final chapter, we're done. But because there is this need, we need to fill it with new generation resources. And in Chapter 7, we start talking about some of those resources and how we value them. So whereas Chapter 8 is looking at your more traditional utility scale resources, in Chapter 7, we talk about these community-based renewable energy resources. So those are resources that we expect to be available, and the way we value them is a little bit different. We add what we call community benefit indicators to them, and we also incorporate that into our scoring for portfolio analysis to get a more comprehensive view of the impacts that certain resources bring to our system that could be made there. And so in Chapter 7, we talk about both about these CBIs and the CBREs. This is a new component of an IRP, and we're excited to be describing our initial efforts at this, though there is certainly more work that needs to be done here, and will be detailed both in this chapter and a following chapter. Angela, is there anything you'd like to add to this?
Yeah, thanks, Seth. Up to this point, I think, Seth, you've done a really good job of talking about how the CEP requirements have really impacted how we do our modeling and how we've improved our modeling to start to decarbonize our supply side resources. I would say that this section of our plan really focuses on those new things that have not been done before. And we spent significant amount of time with everyone in this room walking through, how do you define a CBI? How do you think about community-based renewables, and ultimately where is the point in which community can be part of the decision-making process for CBREs? And so I just want to first acknowledge that a lot of work has gone into that from this group, and thank you for that. We really are committed at evolving our approach to CBIs and CBREs as part of this process. I would say for this plan, there was an ad hoc process of how do we get it into the model, how do we start to meet the requirements of the CP, and then there was a longer term vision of how we would think about CBIs and CBREs in the future. A lot of the work that was done in this group as part of the learning labs will be informing how we go forward and improve our CBIs and our CBRE work. So I just want to publicly make that commitment and let the attendees of this learning lab know that your feedback was heard. We are going to continue to do these learning labs going forward and continue to work to incorporate your feedback into our next potential study, as well as our work to quantify CBIs in the future. And you'll see some of that in our report, where we have started to tee up some research that we've done around CBIs. And we'll probably, Shadia would have better details on this, but we're going to continue the learning labs, and we'll probably bring forth a scope for our potential study going forward in the next couple of months.
Awesome. Thanks,
Hand
Angela.
it back to you.
Cool. So as Angela was describing, the chapter 7 is a pretty quick discussion of the way we've approached CBIs in the near term, basically just for this report. We then turn to chapter 8, which is looking at our other resource options. And so this is also a staple in IRPs where we discuss what's out there. There's, we in chapter 6, we established basically the deficit, the thing that we need to fix, the reason why we're reading this document. Now in chapter 8, we talk about potential solutions. So there are many ways of generating electricity. In this chapter, we discuss the ways that are plausible to be added from the market to our system. So over the next 20 years, we know that there are, despite all the developments going on, most of the resource additions are going to be wind, solar, and storage. Those are going to be the bedrock of any decarbonization plan. I haven't seen a single study that doesn't say build massive amounts of wind, solar, and storage to meet decarbonization goals. I just don't think there's another way. And so we discuss some of them, or our forecasts of the wind, solar, and storage resources, your traditional utility scale options. We talk about the characteristics of what those resources could bring. So, for example, one of our resources is Southeast Washington wind. It has an expected generation portfolio or profile, a generation profile of when it generates, when the wind is blowing, when it's not, and what that means, both on an average basis as well as a resource adequacy basis. And so we also talk about the economics of that Southeast Washington wind resources. Basically, how much does the land cost? How much does the transmission cost? What sort of tax credits can you get from those resources? So we discuss basically all the things that are potential to us. We do include some discussion of emitting resources, so natural gas plants. That said, we are not considering those natural gas plants to be added over the entire planning horizon. They're informational, they're part of some regulatory requirements, and so we have included them in this chapter, but they are not being considered by the utility to pursue at this point. We talk about the specifics of those CBREs, so what the proxy resources are looking like. And I should define that term. So proxy resources in the IRP, we look at general characteristics of plausible options. We don't look at specific projects. So again, I said earlier that Southeast Washington wind resource, that's not a particular site, that doesn't represent a particular facility. It represents rather the general characteristics we can expect based off of the best available forecast to us, what we could get from the Southeast Washington area, both in terms of performance and cost. Of course, when we actually go out to the market in an RFP, we'll be talking about specific wind facilities, but right here in the IRP, these are general proxy resources. So we discuss those for your traditional utility scale as well as your CBRE resources. One new component of this chapter is the additional quantities of energy efficiency and demand response. The way energy efficiency, I'll stick with that to start, is calculated is that taking inputs from the last IRP, so the 2019 IRP, we calculate what's called an avoided cost. Basically, what what the resource would be replacing, what you're avoiding by getting energy efficiency. And we take the cost and we evaluate the cost effectiveness, the economic consideration of that resource versus everything else. And from there, we determine what's cost effective. So there are many ways you can get energy efficiency. You only in the cost effective bucket, we see those programs that are basically cheaper than that avoided resource. Those are considered cost effective. Now, in this coming IRP and CEP, we also evaluated additional quantities of those resources, comparing them to other supply side options. We did the same for demand response. So the data for the energy efficiency came from the ETO. The data for the demand response came from our DSP Part 2. And so we took both of those options, bundled them together in large quantities and compared them to other supply side options. And we found that there is potentially some economic benefits associated with pursuing more energy efficiency than just the cost-effective levels provided by the ETO. We'll discuss that a lot more in portfolio analysis, but in this resource options, we talk about basically what do those additional quantities look like. In this chapter, we also talk about efforts to develop a virtual power plant, which is a coordination of a number of resources and basically what that looks like, what that enables. We're excited about that. We also, in this chapter, look at resource options that are distant. So we're calling them these post-2030 options. We think with the resources available to us, so solar, storage, wind, on-system resources like energy efficiency, demand response, CBREs, we think there are sufficient resources out there to meet our 2030 goals. But when we look forward, especially at that 2040 goal, we think if you had only had access to those 5 or 6 buckets of resources that I just described, you would have significant problem meeting a completely decarbonized system. And keeping that system reliable. The reason is there are just holes in generation associated with all of those resources that the storage can't meet. This is similar to basically all decarbonization studies that I've seen as well. You need something else to meet a fully decarbonized system. And so in this chapter, we discuss briefly and fairly qualitatively some potential options. So hydrogen, nuclear, geothermal, RNG, long duration energy. So we go through a list and discuss a couple things, basically what the resource is, do that quickly, how it could meet those extended holes of times where renewables aren't generating and storage is insufficient to cover them. And then barriers. So, what are the barriers to developing a hydrogen network? There are many. You need the hydrogen. You need to retrofit plants to burn any level over a certain amount, and on and on. The economics. So we discussed some of the barriers to those 2030 options. There's a lot in there, and that Section 8.5, these post-30 resource options, that is going to be an area where we need to focus over the next 15, 20 years as we start thinking about, okay, how do we actually keep lights on when there's no greenhouse gas emissions permitted? It's going to be extremely difficult, and some technological development is going to be needed, whether it be from this list or something else that we're not seeing. But the resources that are available now and that we think will be sufficient for 2030, we do not think will be sufficient through 2040 and beyond. This chapter concludes with a conversation about the ownership structure of additional resources. So when you think about a new resource, the utility can own it, or some third party could own it as well. And we there are pluses and minuses associated with both options. And so we discussed that in this chapter as well. Okay, that's a lot of words for chapter 8. Turning to chapter 9, we look at transmission. So we've established basically what the system need is, given the current forecasts and regulatory environment discussed earlier, and our incorporation of uncertainty. We take a look in a couple chapters, 7 and 8, what potential resource options would be. Now we talk about transmission, and utilities always have to, if they're reliant on off-system resources, they have to transmit that generation from the distant resources to their load. PGE is fairly unique in our geography and contractual reliance on transmission of off-system resources across the BPA system. That BPA system was developed over years and years in the as hydropower was being developed, and it for the longest time we overbuilt that system, so there was plenty of capacity, and because of that we sort of lost, I'm opining at this point, but we've gotten to a point today where there is insufficient capacity to deliver sufficient off-system resources to our load. The why, I could spend a lot of time trying to describe why, and it would be based on my not terribly valuable opinion, but the reality is that we are in a situation right now where there is insufficient capacity to get all the resources that we established earlier in the document to our load. And this is concerning. We earlier IRPs have assumed that there would be sufficient generation capacity, transmission capacity to move that generation to load, but we're not in that world anymore. And so in this chapter, we discuss a number of things. So the regulatory environment under which PGE operates, the contractual transmission rights that PGE has, and then the options to address this need of transmission. There's a lot to this chapter, and but it culminates in some potential options that we have included in later chapters to discuss basically what we're going to do as a utility to deal with the constrained system that we have. So that is chapter 9. We then turn to chapter 10, which is resource economics. And in this chapter, this is another IRP staple. This is in our IRP and others as well, or should be in others. If not a single chapter, then the discussion certainly is, because the economics of the resources are going to drive our decision making as we look to build a system that is least cost and least risk. And so in this chapter, we talk about different sources of cost associated with the resources. So your fixed costs, your variable costs, potentially your integration cost, and then the sources of value. So you have energy value, flexibility value, capacity value, and with those costs and benefits associated with the resource, you can get a more comprehensive picture of what the economic situation is and the best pathway. And so we discuss the approach we take to valuing those resources, and include that in this chapter. So we also discuss in this chapter the community benefit indicators associated with specific resources. We touch on that in chapter 7, but we show the economic impacts of what we described in chapter 7 in chapter 10. We also talk about the evaluation of clean energy resources. As I discussed earlier about energy efficiency, we do these cost effectiveness tests, and we are seeing an issue that's being highlighted both in the analysis in the IRP, and then what we think will be happening forward is this difference in inputs and a different consideration of what resource is actually being avoided when we look at those resources like energy efficiency, demand response, other DERs as well. And so we discuss a little bit some potential problems that any disconnect would have in that regard. We do that in this chapter. Okay, now that we've established the economics of all the potential supply options, with the need established, the regulatory environment established earlier in the document, we then turn to portfolio analysis. And this is, in this chapter, we take all of those components, those inputs. Every other chapter is an input. Chapters 2 through 10 are all inputs into portfolio analysis. We then take those economic considerations and we determine, okay, given the contractual, regulatory, and economic landscapes that are out there, what is the actual least cost, least risk way to maximize community benefits and reduce emissions? We, in this chapter, describe our ways of answering those questions. We have a variety of types of portfolios. We spend a lot of time describing our approach, but basically we take a number of portfolios, we analyze them to answer very specific questions, and then we create a preferred portfolio, which is a regulatory term that always gets capitalized. And we describe what is the preferred portfolio, what are the resources included. So when do you add those solar and storage resources? When does the wind come on? When is the energy efficiency going to be there? We make the determination of that preferred portfolio, which tells us, ideally, given all our projections, all the uncertainty, all of that, what is the best resource path going forward? And so there's pages and pages of analysis in this chapter, but eventually we are just getting down to that preferred portfolio. And then we turn to chapter 12. So we assume that we did a fantastic job in chapter 11 in determining the most optimal preferred portfolio. What do you do about that? So in chapter 12, we discuss what the action plan is going to be going forward. And that action plan is the resource actions that a utility is going to initiate over the next 2 to 4 years. And we turn then from this preferred portfolio, which is a set of nameplate megawatt additions, we turn that into RFP targets. And the action plan is composed of 5 components. So customer actions, incorporating the energy efficiency and demand response forecasts. CBRE action, going after those, the available CBRE potential out there in the market. An action focused on energy, so meeting our energy needs. An action focused on maintaining resource adequacy, and an action focused on transmission expansion. And so we detail each one of those actions in this chapter, and then have a brief discussion about coming RFPs, timing, and process of those. We then turn to chapter 13, which is resiliency, and I will turn this chapter to this discussion over to Angela.
Thank you, Seth. I quickly, before I jump into these slides, I just want to acknowledge Craig's question in the chat around CBIs and the need to address or at least connect the CBIs to affordability. And that is definitely, not only is it one of the requirements that we look at energy equity as part of our CBIs, but it is also one of the CBIs that were prioritized through the mural boarding that this team did, team being all of you in this room. So in our CEP, you'll see a section where we start to tee up some ideas within the CEP of how we'll start to quantify energy equity, but we do expect to come back to this group with actual ideas of how we would value that and make it measurable and quantifiable for future use in the next CEP. Okay, and hopefully, Craig, that answers your question. Still more to come on that. Our chapter for resiliency is really, I would say it's more technical, technically focused than some of the conversations we've had here in the learning labs around resiliency and how community views resiliency. And I think that that's really partially, well, I would say that's really because of the requirements and under UM 2225, where we are required to assess the risk and opportunities of resiliency and evaluate how we might be, evaluate our system through things like a bow tie method or concepts like zone of tolerance. So when you read through this chapter, you may not hear as many themes around community because it has that more technical component of it, of like risk modeling. But we've laid it out in a way that'll hopefully flow nicely for like, how do we evaluate the system? How do we evaluate risk? So you can see our existing work to date. It's not intended to be inclusive of all things of how we evaluate risk, just some examples of the work that we've done to date. We do bring in the new concept of zone of tolerance that came from the OPUC's resiliency standards practice and manual. And I would say the zone of tolerance, while that term might come directly from the manual that staff put together, there's quite a bit of work that we've done that feeds into that concept. So many of you worked with us on our distribution system plan where we started to do energy equity indexing. We started to look at Justice 40 initiatives. We've brought in those concepts into our zone of tolerance and are committed to continuing to build out that portion of our work. So you'll see that in this chapter. Then you'll see programs and opportunities. These are existing programs that we have today that we're looking to build on, as well as future programs. So there is a connection here to our community IRP that we've talked about in the learning labs. We do intend to use that to help inform opportunities for resiliency within our communities. But we also have some discussion in here, and I think throughout the document around federal stimulus dollars and how we might work with community on that. And then we have, as a closer for this section, a looking ahead section, which really is our commitment to continue to work with within the learning labs with our partners on the resiliency requirements, and also to think about how resiliency is, how community views resiliency, and how we might be able to partner not just within the CEP, but also in our distribution system plan through things like our non-wires solutions. Okay, next slide. And our last chapter is our community lens chapter. And this really speaks to all of the hard work that has gone into from our communities and our partners in building out our learning labs, and speaks to all of the work that was done within our learning labs through things like mural boarding, surveys. Many of you met with us one-on-one to talk about how we might approach the CEP. So in the community lens portion of our CEP, we really focus on what were the different strategies and channels that we use to engage, but also sets up the framework for how we would like to continue to engage going forward. There are some very specific requirements around community engagement in UM 2225. For example, we were required to do surveys to measure the effectiveness of community engagement. We have in the past, through our distribution system plan, discussed using other models for evaluating the effectiveness of community engagement. And I just want to point out that we still intend to do things that we've committed to within the DSP, as well as meet the requirements of the clean energy plan. Most notably for this work, I would say the community lens portion of our work is really setting the stage for how we approach our next CEP, taking all of the learnings through this process, hearing from our partners on what's important to be able to inform steps, not just within our clean energy plan for our next one, but also all of our plans. And how do we start to connect the dots and bring all of our plans together in a way that's really accessible and easy for people to understand how we're making decisions and why. So that's the conclusion of our report. And Samantha, I'll kick it over to you to open it up for questions or anything like that.
Well, thank you, Angela and Seth, for your presentations of walking us through our big premiere that will premiere at the end of the month, our filing. I wanted to see and do a temperature check. I know that was a lot of information for folks to digest and process. Do we want to take a quick break before we get into our next presentation? We were thinking, I know it's 11:18, but maybe a quick 5-minute break if you need to step away. That feel okay? Yeah, I feel like people might need a little break. It was dense. So, and then we can have questions when we get back. That sound good?
So what time are you thinking, Samantha?
11:24.
11:24. Okay, great.
5 minutes, or did I do that right? Yeah. Yes. 11:24 we'll return. All right, everyone, it's 11:24. Thanks for coming back. Angela, before we get into I still want to go back to questions to see if people had questions about everything that was presented in this first segment between you and Seth. And then I believe you wanted to speak to the next steps in the clean energy plan. If Angela's there, are people back? No. Oh, there you are. Okay.
Yeah.
I
Hi.
still want to have reserved time for questions. So,
Okay.
go
Do you
ahead.
want me to, well, do you want to open up for questions or you want me to jump in? It should just take a second. I just wanted to let everyone know that we intend to file at the end of this month as the next step for the CEP. And then there is a regulatory process that we go through with the OPUC where they'll set a schedule for going, you know, how they will, the process that they'll go through to review our CEP IRP for acknowledgement. And as part of that process is a public engagement process. And I just encourage everybody to participate in that process as well. And Seth, I don't know if you have anything you want to add specific to that, but I think typically the process goes 6 to 8 months is my understanding. So.
Yeah, that's correct. And we'll be, it's a pretty lengthy process, not only in duration, but also there's a docket process where we meet in front of the commission and provide comments. There'll be hundreds and hundreds of pages written about our plans as well, both from us and from interveners into the party. And many on this call in this group are part of this process. We invite everyone to participate because it refines our plan. And so looking forward to that over the rest of the year.
Thank you, Angela and Seth. So I have a question in the chat. Is it Kara or Kara? How different are you expecting the CEP to look from the IRP? And I don't know who wants to take that. Is that Angela or Seth? Angela, it's Women's History Month. We're gonna go with Angela first.
I will say for this first round, you know, just to kind of take a step back, we got our CEP requirements under UM 2225 in October, end of October of last year. And so there was a substantial amount of work that was done on the IRP prior to that. I think that process starts like 2 years before we even file. And then it's informed also by the previous IRP that we submitted. So I would say, while we're filing as one report, and we're trying to make sure that it flows and people can see how things are connected. I mean, I think generally what you'll see is that the IRP is doing a lot of analytical improvements and is working to meet the goal of, 100% decarbonized by 2040, and Seth can speak to that. But there's still a lot of work that needs to be done on the CEP side to truly start to integrate some of those core components into our IRP. But we've done substantial amount of work to start to integrate the CEP requirements into the IRP modeling. So I don't know, that's kind of a non-answer. I don't know, Seth, if you have anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, I would just say that there are a lot of things in this CEP that come out of IRP analysis. And so separating them, there are additional components of the CEP that aren't part of the IRP, but they're pretty few. And I think the idea is that as we go forward, as we refine the CEP, the idea is, at least as I see it, is that they basically become the same thing, and that the IRP incorporates everything that has been outlined in the CEP. As Angela said, the requirements are still being established, and we fairly recently have heard what the expectations are in this first CEP, and so we've made our best attempt to identify the information and present the information that folks were expecting. But I think it seems like this is the first time we're doing it, and so we'll be better defining expectations and requirements as we go through this docket over the next 6 to 8 months, and then also start working on the next one where we but my expectation is that when you look, say, 50 or 100 years down the road, barring any other change, like we're really looking at one document that incorporates everything together. That seems to be the most logical way of doing it, for what that's worth.
And I think that that was that long-term vision that you mentioned, Seth, is really why we are filing them together, because we do see that there shouldn't be any daylight between the two. And we'll be interested to hear how well we did on that when you review it.
Thanks, Seth and Angela. We have a hand raised.
Yeah, so I thought I just
yourself.
yeah, just to so hi, Kara Saylor, Green Energy Institute. For process purposes, so I'm just sort of trying to get my head around, like, we're gonna see these documents filed March 31st. You all waived and was granted the requirement to file a draft. So we have some time to file comments, and then there'll be another iteration of the document. From your perspective, like comments during that time, I mean, I think the intent was that they be directed at the IRP, but because they're so intertwined, the CEP and IRP are so intertwined in so many ways, does it make sense to that comments will sort of be directed at both documents? And then like, what do you think would be most helpful to hear, in knowing that you have just a very short turnaround to do anything useful? What would be most helpful to hear from stakeholders that can kind of help you figure out how to kind of get on the right track and satisfy stakeholders?
Yeah, appreciate that question. So the first thing I would say is that the initial comments period after, so 30 days after we file, is the proposed schedule for those initial comments. And 30 days after that, basically at the end of May, we're going to be responding to those initial comments. We're not going to make an iteration on the document itself. That will stay filed and fixed, but hopefully we'll be responsive to all those comments. In terms of what would be most helpful, compliments as to how good of we're really looking
That's not helpful, Seth.
we're looking for basically expectations, anything that we missed. So if you expected to see any bit of information that A, you think we have, or B, you think we don't, that would be useful to know. The general direction of the plan, whether you think we're going down the right path, or you think other things need to be addressed or presented as we get into the docket, I think would be good. And then also just direction. So does this seem reasonable? Does it pass the laugh test right now as we get into the docket? Over the docket will be, everybody will go through all of our materials and say, whether this is an appropriate forecast, whether this thing was calculated correctly. And we'll do that over the next 6 months. But for those initial comments, really is just like, are we moving in the right direction? And I would say that I would just create one set of comments for the IRP and CP together. So just one document saying, what worked, what didn't, what you want to see differently in this coming docket.
Yeah.
And can I ask
I'll
one
point
follow-up
out,
question? Sorry.
Yeah, Kara, I would just clarify that we're filing one report. So we'll have a regulatory crosswalk as an appendix, so you can see which sections have the CP requirements versus the IRP requirements. Let us know if that's helpful to kind of navigate through the document as well. And then what I would agree with Seth on, like, what's important, and what's important to you. What do you want to see more of? What would you like to see changed? going forward, those, I think those things would be helpful because we had pretty short engagement stint for the CEP and tried to gather as much information as we could to feed into the CEP. But once we actually have a CEP IRP, we'll be able to react to that. And so I think that that would be good to hear people's thoughts.
I just have one follow-up question before you go to Craig, because utilities often file IRP updates, right? Or I think required to. Sometimes it's directed by the PGE to identify, or sorry, by the PUC to identify specific things to include in your IRP update. Since this is such a, like, once it's filed and time keeps moving, I mean, are you already sort of thinking about the kinds of things that you would include in an IRP update?
So that's a great question. I think I'm 80% confident about this. The requirement is that the IRP update be filed a year after commission acknowledgement. And so that's probably end of 2024. Are we thinking about what would be included? We are definitely thinking about what's going to be included in the next IRP. And next CEP, there's a list of things that I know I want addressed and shortcomings that we have in this current IRP, and happy to discuss any of those. But for the IRP update, generally what the commission and stakeholders are looking for is using basically the same methods that you used in the last IRP. But given all the new information that we have from, the filing date of March 31st, much will change over those next 18 months. And so the IRP update is really just intended to say, okay, given all the things that we learned over the last 18 months, does that plan still sort of make sense? And so it's not going to be a place where we'll be able to introduce a significant amount of new methodology. We might be able to outline some new bells and whistles that we attach to it, but it's basically going to be the same car.
Okay, sorry, one more follow-up. Don't know if this is at all appropriate. This will be the first time I'm really digging into an electric company's IRP, but what is it at all appropriate to identify, knowing that this is sort of this a little bit exploratory process, right? This first CEP IRP, everyone's sort of learning. Is it at all appropriate to include an appendix of the things that you anticipate addressing in the next IRP, just so that stakeholders can kind of see where you see the holes?
Another great question. So I don't think it's appropriate in the appendix of the current one, given the uncertainty of the docket. So there are things that I personally think should be changed, but the stakeholders and commission might think very different things. And, we don't want to, we have limited resources and we want to devote them to the most pressing and interesting areas, and that might not be what I have in my mind. And so rather than putting it in the document, though, we're hoping to, in the next roundtable, which is March 30th in a couple of weeks, we're hoping to, at a high level, discuss some of the improvements that I'd like to, and that we would like to see over the next couple of years. And I'm also, so that's one area of identification. And also I'd hope that these areas that, we've got in our mind is a significant area of discussion over the docket. So, an example of this is the temporal resolution of our capacity expansion model. So we build, or we add resources in a modeling area based on yearly demands. And I'd like that, see that change to either quarterly or monthly demands. Hopefully that is discussed, the implications of that, so that everybody can say, yes, that's a great idea to make this change before we go down the path of investing all this time and effort it would take to make this change. So hopefully this will be part of the docket and a long discussion.
And I would add that there are some sections of the report where we have a section called Looking Ahead. And those are areas that we've identified for improvement going forward. We also have an appendix of feedback that we heard through our Learning Lab process for feedback we've gotten through Mural Board, which we weren't able to incorporate into this CEP, but look to incorporate going forward. And we don't have any defined actions of like how we would incorporate those yet, because we want to work with our partners on it, and just like would make the like distinction between there are things that get done inside the model, like what Seth was mentioning, and then there's analysis that gets done outside the model that feeds in as an input. And I would say like my team really focuses on being an input into the model, and we want to get that section right over the next year, because we'll have to get that to Seth, so a year ahead of when he actually needs to issue like the next IRP, so he can start to run analysis and do things like that. So that's why we're trying to bring together Seth's team and then my team and these learning labs, so we can start to think about like how does the work feed into each other and help our partners connect the dots there.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that.
All right, we have a question. We have two in the queue. So we have Craig first, and then we have a comment from Arlene that I can read after Craig's question. Craig.
Yes, thank you. Actually, what I'm offering are three, what I consider to be major caveats regarding the action plan. And I can be brief. The first one is EE, energy efficiency. When you look at the vast discrepancy between historical savings between BPA and the Power Planning Council, and when you know that savings are deemed or projected, not verified, to the tune of about 98% of the programs, I think that verifying what is really being saved is critically important right now. And it hasn't been vetted, and it needs to be. The other one, you talk about adequacy. I never hear anything about what constitutes excessive consumption. Is it reasonable that Bill Gates in his 66,000 square foot house pays the same per kilowatt as you and I, when his consumption is obviously driving the need to create more resources and address the shortfalls? And the last one is in terms of transmission. I don't hear very much analysis relative to the notion of centralized versus decentralized distributed generation. And that obviously, if we're focused more on decentralized, the need for transmission is significantly reduced. So where are the trade-offs there in your analysis and plan? Thank you.
For the first 2 points, I would just say that, well, for the first point, monitoring energy efficiency, absolutely, full agreement with you there. Outside of the PGE planning department purview to do that, but I would certainly agree that we need to be sure that these savings are happening. In terms of excessive consumption, more head nods from me, absolutely. Again, though, out of the purview, even PGE itself, we don't have the ability to limit that consumption. And we also, while we do have low-income assistance programs, we don't have that tiered rate structure as you're describing. This plan was created based off the current policy. You would, I think, have a lot of support for changing that, but for now, this plan is created off of that. For the third part, we do discuss the centralization of distributed resources in the VPP section. It is a pretty exciting frontier in electricity system planning, but we're pretty much at the infancy of that right now. We're trying to get that VPP off off the ground. But I do think that when you see the next IRP, so in 2025 or 2026, whenever that happens, I think there will be a much more robust discussion and for us, and then for others as well, as you start seeing the success or failures of attempts to do that. So not really answering any of those points, but those were my initial thoughts on them.
All right, thank you, Craig, for your comment and question and suggestion. We do have a question from Arlene in the chat, and it says, I'm interested in the energy efficiency argument for incorporating non-cost effective actions because the legislator is considering various bills where energy efficiency is a large part. Hopefully your analysis will support the incorporation of these energy efficiency actions. Would you support using your IRP information / conclusions for that purpose?
What a great question. So there's been a significant amount of investigation into this topic, and I'll give you the very high level cliff notes. We evaluated this energy efficiency. We found that if you look at costs on a long-term system benefit, costs and benefits, that additional component of energy efficiency is found to be cost effective. But if you look at the near-term rate impacts, given the policy environment under which energy efficiency is currently operated, you see significant near-term price increases associated with that energy efficiency. I think, so let me finalize that thought. Given that uncertainty that Craig highlighted before, as well as the near-term rate impacts, we are not including that additional energy efficiency into our action plan. We're just taking the cost-effective forecast from the ETO and putting and incorporating that into the actions we are going to undertake. But our analysis clearly shows, and we almost never get crystal clear results in portfolio analysis, but the energy efficiency analysis is unambiguous. It is a cost-effective means of reducing cost. It is a means of reducing cost and risk over the long term if you add additional energy efficiency. And so I would be shocked if that analysis was not used to change the policy environments surrounding energy efficiency. Does that answer the question?
Hi, Seth. Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Ooh, one last point about that. If you look at the portfolio analysis from the March 8th roundtable that's available, I can post in the link, in the chat, the link to that. But there are very clear slides that show that benefit and the costs associated with the current policy environment about that energy efficiency. So we can provide those materials. There's long discussion about it in that roundtable, and happy to help clarify in that analysis any way possible.
All right, thank you, everyone. I just want to going back to our operating agreement. So I want to say accept and expect non-closure. We may not be able to get to every topic today. We've had some really great discussion right now. I will say that we will be recording this, and it's being recorded. So if you have to go at noon and we want to honor your time, you can watch this portion of our presentation later when we send out the video links. But I just want to check the room and see if we have any more questions about the IRP CEP filing, or just check in before we move forward. Okay, it looks like we don't have questions at this time, but feel free to raise your hand or ask the question in the chat if something comes to mind. Thanks, and I'll pass it off to you, Seth. I will say this segment of the presentation was requested. I'm not sure if they're in the room today, but we heard this, that folks wanted to learn a little more about in depth about the preferred portfolio. And I think it's the yearly, I can't remember, yearly price impact, sorry.
Sure.
So-
Yeah, I can move pretty quick through this. And let me know if we want to go past noon or if I should try to hit it all. But we've discussed a lot of this before. If you move to the first slide, for the preferred portfolio, there were 5 main questions about long-term resource planning that we sought to answer with our portfolio analysis. So essentially, what is the pace of decarbonization that we should enact between now, or that we should plan for between now and 2030? What should we do about CBREs? That's 2. 3, what should we do about that additional quantity of energy efficiency and demand response that we were modeling? That's 4. And 5 is, what do we do about transmission? And so these are the main questions that we sought to answer with portfolio analysis. The answers are on the left here. So for the decarbonization glide path, we're looking at a planned linear decline between now and 2030, because we think it best balances cost, risk, and the rate of those greenhouse gas reductions. We think we should go after 100% of all the CBREs that we can get our hands on right now. We're looking at, as I was just describing, we're looking at the cost-effective levels of energy efficiency and demand response, incorporating that into our system in an attempt to minimize near-term rate impacts and risk. And then for transmission, looking at the alleviation of congestion across the south of Alston flowgate. So that's basically looking at ways to alleviate BPA congestion, and then also looking at potential off-system wider geographic transmission expansion options past the BPA system. So in our modeling parlance, we've said that this is Nevada and Wyoming resources, but again, these are proxy options that don't represent actual specific projects. So those are the main components. And then when you take those main answers and put them into the portfolio analysis, you get the following couple slides, which shows the resource build. If you could go to the next one, please. So this is the cumulative resource build through 2030. You can see the answers here to the question. So CBREs, we're taking the 4th line down. We're taking, this represents 100% of the available CBREs. There are transmission options, so the south of Alston relief is included in there, as well as additional Nevada and Wyoming options. There's a massive build out wind, solar, and storage going through 2030. And then we also incorporate the cost-effective levels of energy efficiency and demand response shown at the bottom. So this table, and this is also inclusive of the 2021 all-source RFP, which is ongoing. You see something similar in the next slide. So this is the exact same information, but then scaled out to 2043. So all those resources, what's included in the preferred portfolio. This is largely informational, though, again, given the challenges that we discussed with meeting 2040, completely non-emitting system. This would be a challenge to operate this system, given the resources that we have selected here. You show it in tabular format, in table format. In the next slide, whichever it is, this is the exact same information in the previous slide. So these are all the resources selected. And then in the following slide, talk about just the metrics, the cost and risk metrics associated with that preferred portfolio. These are in millions, so this is a very large number, but this is the cumulative net present value of all the generating resources over 20 years. The final slide just talks about our RPS obligation. Basically, given the requirements to meet HB 2021, RPS constraints are never going to bind, assuming that we're able to acquire the resources necessary to comply with HB 2021. This is equivalent of having 2 alarm clocks, one at 5 a.m. and one at 7 a.m. The 7 a.m., assuming you know it's snooze, will never do anything. RPS is now the 7 a.m. HB 2021 is 5 a.m. That's the thing that's going to push us to be adding those resources. So we're going to have far more RECs generated than we'll ever need to comply with RPS legislation. Okay, that was super quick. Let me know if you have questions on any of these resource builds. Oh, I do see one in the chat. Have we attempted to anticipate future costs to consumers? Yes, that is a perfect segue. Thank you. So the next section, we're going to talk about the yearly price impacts. So we can just move right to it if you advance 2 slides. Actually, 3 slides. So this is something new that came out of the CEP, and it's an interest that we heard, and now a requirement to produce the cost estimates for yearly price impacts associated with all the resources that we just described. And there's a lot of caveats here. So we do produce these estimates, and they'll be shown in just a couple slides, but we think it's important to identify first that these estimates are based off the resources that we just provided and nothing else. And so we talk about the costs associated with generation, but there are also significant other costs that will go into the revenue requirement, which translates into rates. Things like grid modernization, wildfire, transmission distribution costs, those aren't included in the estimates that are going to follow. And so they can only be thought of, the estimates that we're going to present are a lower bound of cost estimates that are going to go forward, given all of the assumptions about the economics and policy and everything else that we talked about, the uncertainties going forward. They're also extremely sensitive to assumptions about generic resource costs. So it's possible that given the extreme demands that the industry has for non-emitting resources, both in our state and across the WEC, it's reasonable to forecast that there'll be significant cost declines as people get more efficient with those resources. However, given that demand, it's also reasonable to assume that there's only so many areas of interconnection of renewable generation. It's possible that renewable resources go up. And so given these costs, we are only looking, that it's reasonable to think that there could be a wide variety of potential cost outcomes. So we're, whatever your estimate of those renewable prices are going forward, if that differs from what we have in our reference case, then you'll be looking at something very different. If you go to the next slide. So also sensitive to assumptions about ownership and the ability to take advantage of available tax credits, and there are a number of other assumptions that are listed in this that I'll just leave here. Happy to discuss any of these, but they're just basically setting the stage for how we got to these estimates, which are shown on the next slide. So these are the yearly price impacts, and you'll see there are 25 lines, and these are normalized by megawatt hour. So this is the $1 per megawatt hour price change that we expect from the preferred portfolio from now through 2030. And there's a wide discrepancy here, or a wide distribution of potential outcomes given your assumptions about the ownership structure of the resources that are procured, and as well as the ability to take advantage of those tax options. So that's what forms the distribution of all those gray lines. The red line there is your reference case, which we're saying is a 100% tax credit opportunity and a 50% ownership structure between PGE owning the resources and third-party PPAs. So that's the cost increase that we are projecting associated with the existing and incremental resource additions that are included in the preferred portfolio. Does that explanation make sense? And do these estimates make sense? Yeah, I see a hand.
Yes.
Hi, thanks, Seth. Just a question. I'm guessing there'll be more information in the final document about this, but I guess I would be curious what the lowest line is there. What does that reflect? If the middle line is 50%, what does the lowest line say?
Yeah, so the Inflation Reduction Act changed the availability and timeline of tax credits, as well as the levels associated with them. So whereas before, I'm reasonably confident there 100% of the tax credit was an upper bound, or you can't get a more than 100%. Now there are additional provisions in the law that allow for a much higher tax credit level than that 100% level, which just means that the tax credits could go up. And so depending on the tax credit level and the ownership level, it's possible, you know, that lowest line, you see this giant dip in 2026, that's because there is in the preferred portfolio a massive storage build out, which qualifies for the ITC, which hits in year one. And so because of that ITC, if we own all of it and we get, you know, upwards of 150% of that tax credit, that could potentially significantly reduce costs in that particular year. Now, the cost of those resources do hit you eventually. So, I mean, you could think of this as a 2026 strategy, just build 5,000 megawatts of storage, you'll reduce and own all of it. You know, you could reduce your year one rates, but that does have a massive bill that comes later. So I don't think that's the best strategy, but we are showing here that depending on, that tax credit utilization and your ownership structure, it could be under reference case assumptions that these that the price impacts of these generation resources can be lower, can be negative in certain years.
So the more you own, the less the cost, because you're accumulating the tax credit. Is that the main driver for the ownership percentage and cost? Is that the main? Is it just that who owns the tax credit?
Yeah, so there is we looked at a 5x5 graph here of all the ownership and all the tax credit assumptions, and there are some interesting dynamics there. But one of the clear ones is, yes, if as you increase tax credit and increase tax credit levels and increase ownership, you do see that decline. But you have to, the other impacts are fairly hard to describe. We will provide all this data, and I'm sure there'll be much more discussion about it, but there are some interesting dynamics where it's not, they start moving in three-dimensional ways, which gets a little weird to explain.
Okay, great. Yeah, super helpful. And thank you. And do consider just sort of elucidating all of that in writing, just so that sort of the layperson can kind of understand why you're choosing why you're choosing a middle pathway. And of course you're doing that, right, to evaluate the most likely outcome, or to evaluate all the risks associated with each of those things, right? Of ownership and tax credit. Yeah.
So this isn't a choice we make, especially in the IRP or CEP. It'll be up to determination in the RFP, how that ownership structure works. Is 50-50 the most that's where I'm, question, is it the most likely? I'm not really sure. And I don't know if history is going to be the best predictor of the future there. Also for the tax credit, I'm not sure if 100% is most likely. So if there is a question, if I'm asked a question, why is the red line red and the other lines are gray? They're round numbers. It's pretty arbitrary which you think is the most likely, though. And they're the ones in the middle, and so that's why they're chosen here. But we haven't gotten in much more detail than that.
Okay. And maybe you don't need to, but definitely explain why it's a red line.
Sure.
And then, you might do like a high and a low, just so that people understand, they don't have to understand every line on there, but so that they understand somewhat what you're modeling here, right? What does this chart show? What does it demonstrate, and how is it useful?
Yeah, the flip side there is that if we show that high and low, the only uncertainty we're showing in this figure is that tax and ownership uncertainty, but there's the bars would, get much higher if you start bringing in uncertainty over renewable costs and load growth and all of that. And so we have the ability to produce this graph under different results, but this was a new requirement that was codified in commission order, I think in December. And so we finalized these results, I don't want to say yesterday, but maybe the day before. So it hasn't been that long. And so we're very open to what analysis would help. We'll give you the treatment that we have in the IRP and some explanation, but there's this is very much the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we could do. And we're excited about the new capabilities, but also kind of terrified at how many different ways you could look at it, given the workload required to produce these estimates. So yes.
Yeah, and how useful it is in the long term, right?
For sure.
But at the same time, that is really helpful because it can help stakeholders figure out what you have done here, and then they can evaluate what more is necessary to give a more complete picture.
For sure.
And whether that's worth it, right?
Yep.
So yeah, so super helpful. Thanks, Seth. Sorry to take up so much time.
No, not at all. And another area of usefulness of those initial comments, highlighting what you'd like to say. I would say also one caveat that's important that I may have missed is that, these are what we're calling price impacts. They're not necessarily rate impacts. And there certainly there's a large number of factors that will eventually lead to rate impacts that are not included in this. So I don't think it would be appropriate to say that, okay, we're at about $80 a megawatt hour. We're going to about, a little north of 90. That's just not an appropriate way to characterize coming changes to rates, which take years and years to set, GRCs, all of that. So this is, I think, helpful directional information, certainly not comprehensive.
All right, so title that chart something different then, so that it doesn't get taken out of context.
Can I put you on the spot for a suggestion?
Like tentative, or based on one fact or something, so that it's like really clear this is not necessary. I mean, these are the discussions we're having, right, in gas versus electric. And I just don't want anybody to misunderstand what this chart shows.
Agreed. Yeah, about half of our discussion about in the document about what this chart is about what it's not. And so, yes, want to clearly articulate that both in the docket and in the document.
So we have a question with Sylvia has her hand up. Sylvia?
Thank you. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Seth, are you, or when you're looking at the potential costs here, how are you guys thinking about the risk of hitting a cost cap? Maybe if not after this, like maybe if not in the CEP, at some point in the future, because I'm definitely hearing a lot of chatter about that, and I just wonder what the utilities' thoughts about that are.
Yeah, great question. So, going back to middle school, to calculate a percent, you need a numerator and a denominator. And we have established in HB 2021 that 6% language. What is included in the numerator and what's included in the denominator hasn't been established. And so it's really difficult to say right now what resources count towards the cost cap and what don't. And so before you're able to, I think where you're going is like, how do you translate this to a cost cap or an evaluation of where you're at under the cost cap? Like, does this going from $80 a megawatt hour to 90, does that trigger that 6% or not? I think is an extremely relevant question, but something I don't think we're able to answer yet until you say what's the numerator, what's the denominator. So 6%, if we say we're hitting that cost cap exactly, does that mean the change in total revenue requirement? Does it mean the change in revenue requirement associated with the resources for HB 2021? Because remember, if we didn't have HB 2021, if for some reason that wasn't passed and we're in a different world, we're still having a conversation today about how to meet energy and capacity needs going forward, given everything else that's going on. And so it really is unclear right now what, is it just the additional non-emitting resources that are required to meet HB 2021 above a reliable system? I don't think anyone has answered that question. And so we're not really able to think about that. There's also uncertainty about what happens if you're over 6%. So what if you figure out the numerator and the denominator and it's actually 12%? What happens then? As far as I understand in the statute, it says that the commission, someone can ask the commission to look at it. I don't know what that means either. So I'm really not answering your question here, but I don't think there's a good connection between this graph and that calculation.
That's helpful, Seth. It's helpful to kind of get a sense of all of the many uncertainties involved. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Cool.
Checking to see if we have any more questions. We are over on time, so if you have to jet, I understand. There will be a recording. I placed our link to our website. Just looking to see, it doesn't look like it, so maybe we go to the next steps. Okay, so I want to thank our presenters today, Angela Long and Seth Wiggins, for walking us through and giving us a preview of what's going to be filed at the end of the month. For our next steps, we will have our next learning lab, which will be Thursday, April 20th at 10 a.m. and 12 p.m. We have them every third Thursday. And this will be focused on transportation electrification. So this should be fun. I know it's a topic that a lot of people have a lot of interest in. Also want to say, again, it's in the chat, you can visit our website, which has all of our Clean Energy Plan materials. You can also go under the resource tab, which you can look for the IRP roundtables and such, and just explore our website. It has some really cool things on it. And also, if you'd like more information or you have questions after this presentation or just in general, you can email us at cep@pgn.com. So I want to thank again everyone for participating and attending our Learning Lab for the Clean Energy Plan series. And we hope to see you next month as we discuss transportation electrification. Again, happy Women's History Month, and you all have a great sunny Thursday. We actually have sun and it's supposed to be 60. So I hope you get outside today. Thanks.